Hi there, I'm Tom Munson. Welcome to History at High Noon. Today we're talking about one of my favorite Sioux City subjects, and that is Sioux City's brick industry. So like I begin every presentation, let's start at the very beginning. Or actually, instead of starting at the beginning, let's see what people were saying in 1922. So when Sioux City's oldest inhabitants were boys, brick was an important manufacturing product of Sioux City. And when the sons of these same citizens are forgotten, Sioux City will still be making brick. So great are the deposits here. So that's what they were saying in 1922. Let's see what the previous 70 years were like to get us up to that point. Sioux City's first brickyard was that of Leeds Robinson. Now, Leeds Robinson started this brickyard in 1856, and it was located near West 4th and Perry Creek today. You can see in images here, Sioux City's first brick house built out of Leeds Robinson's first firing. And on the right side of the screen, there were enough brick left over to build the Buckrucker or Schuster block, which was located at 3rd and Pearl Street. So taking a look at what kind of brick these early brick makers were making, people like Leeds Robinson, and a little bit about the history of world brick manufacturing. The first bricks ever made were hand molded beginning around 9,000 years ago. You can see here an image of a wood brick mold. Now these date back to as far back as about 6,000 years ago and were used predominantly throughout the Middle East. Looking at how bricks were dried, well, at the beginning, long ago, the world's oldest bricks were just dried by the air. Firing brick in earthen kilns, often called clamp kilns, originated in China around 6,500 years ago. The image you see in the lower left is a pile of brick that is about to be covered by earth to make a clamp kiln. But starting in the late 19th century, and even a little before that, other kilns, permanent kilns, were being manufactured or built to produce brick, and this is it goes back to the early 20th century, and most of Sioux City's early clamp kilns were replaced by permanent kilns in the late 1800s or early 1900s. Now focusing on modern brick making, so as far as Sioux City is concerned, we're talking about brick manufacturing, modern brick manufacturing that would have dominated here by the 1890s. So like the primitive methods, clay and other minerals are removed from the earth, either by hand or in a more modern era by steam shovel, and then they're stored. The different clays unearthed from clay beds are selected for certain characteristics to make a variety of products like tile, common brick, face brick, or terracotta. Once the clay is mixed, it's moved into pulverizers which help break down the larger components and make a fine clay mixture. Now this clay mixture is then mixed with small amounts of water to help bind the clay and help move that clay through a brick machine or a pug mill. And those machines extrude the clay into basically a ribbon. As that ribbon passes down a conveyor, it is cut either by wire or spiral blade to produce what we would recognize as bricks. But these are unfired bricks, so they're called green bricks. Once the bricks have actually been made, they're moved from the conveyor either by hand or machine and moved onto carts. These brick-filled carts are moved into drying tunnels or just into the air. In drying tunnels, drying is sped because in these drying tunnels, temperatures up to 200 degrees helps remove moisture so the bricks are ready to be fired. Once the dried bricks are removed from the dryers, they're transported to kilns, where they could be fired for up to 6 days at temperatures up to 2100 degrees Fahrenheit. Now once fired, the cooled bricks are removed from the kilns and stacked and ready to be transported to your building site. Now on the bottom of the screen you can see here on the lower left is a drying outfit. These could either be homemade in your own town, or they could be ordered from clay products manufacturers. On the lower right, you see a kiln. So these are the kind of pieces of equipment that we are using in the modern manufacturing of brick. So the Sioux City area's second brickyard was that of the Holman Brothers in Sergeant Bluff. Now they started in 1867. However, this was not the first time this clay bank had been worked, as T. Elwood Clark had started manufacturing brick in Sergeant Bluff in 1856, the same time Leeds Robinson had begun in Sioux City. So here we can see C.J. Holman, A.M. Holman, and their clay bank. If you're familiar with the area, this is a clay bank that would have been just west of the present Woodbury Township Cemetery near the Holman Brickyard. Now in this map, you can see there in section 30, you can see the C.J. and A.M. Holman just south of the cemetery. So this is the area that the Holman brothers were working starting in the late 1860s and throughout the remainder of the 19th century. The 1893 Iowa Geological Survey published some great articles about brickmaking here in northwestern Iowa, and they created these illustrations of the segments of the hills that the brickmakers were using. And in this case, we can see the different layers of clay there on the right, and then on the other side, on the left, are descriptions of what we're seeing. So of course, the Sioux City area is known, and western Iowa is known for its loess deposits. The loess is just that little bit of wind-driven soil that sits on top of these hills. Below that is a layer of sandstone, and below that lignitic shale, potter's clay, fire clay. Level 3 is variegated clay. This is great for making paving brick. The bottom levels, level 1 and 2, is a red clay, which is used for things like pressed brick and terracotta. Just looking at some of the advancements from the Holmans, from a primitive brick manufacturer to an advanced modern brick manufacturer. So the entire operation when they began in the 1860s relied on hand-molded brick and clamp kilns. The Holmans partially mechanized in 1869 and built some permanent kilns. Throughout the 1880s, we see improvement of facilities like new drying sheds, steam-powered brick machinery, brick presses. Penfield brick machine was added in 1887, so the plant could produce 38,000 brick in about 9 hours. Later in the 1880s, we see new kilns and machinery adding up to about $5,000. By 1890, the Holmans had a mostly mechanized plant with 6 kilns. They operated seasonally, so from about April to October, with 40 to 50 employees. Daily production of the facility was about 35,000 brick, and year-round they could manufacture about 5 million brick. By 1890, their primary products were paving brick, hollow brick, common tile, and drain tile. Now there on the right-hand side of the screen, you can see a clay crusher, and below that is a Penfield pug mill or a brick machine. In the 1870s, the Sioux City Journal published an article about brick production in the Sioux City area, and in that, the Holmans had one of the largest stockpiles at the beginning of 1870. They had about 1 million brick on hand. Just looking at some of the projects that Holman Brick went into through the 1880s, well, they sold 500,000 brick for Bogue's packing plant in 1881. Now that would have been about a quarter of the brick needed for that packing plant when it was first built. The Holmans made brick for the Jant and Tompkins block, which was in downtown Sioux City on the south side of 4th Street. That was in 1884. The images you see on the side are the Hotel Garretson and the Silverhorn packing plant. So the Holmans also made brick for these projects in 1886 and 1887. The Holmans also have the distinction of making and installing the first paving brick used on Sioux City streets. The first intersection of Sioux City streets paved was 4th and Pierce, and that was in 1888. Moving into the later 19th century, the Holmans added new kilns to their facility in 1896 up to 1901. So C.J. Holman had designed and patented a new type of downdraft kiln in 1895. So between 1896 and 1901, 11 of these new kilns were added to the Holman yard. The Holman brothers also got into pottery for just a little bit. Now, this is the first time we're really mentioning pottery in the Sioux City area, and it's kind of an allied industry with the brick industry. You can see on the left is a picture of an urn manufactured by the Holman brothers for the reburial of Sergeant Floyd in 1895. Now with this batch of clay, they also made other products like this jug you can see on the right. They made several of these jugs, but as far as I can tell, the Holmans never really got into any more pottery production after this first little trial in the 1890s. This is just an overview of the Holman Brothers brickyard around 1901. We're looking from the southwest kind of off to the northeast. Now I mentioned with the Holmans they were making some pottery. Well, they weren't the only pottery manufacturer in the Sioux City area. The Dakota City Pottery in Nebraska had started in 1858, but employee Pius Neff moved that pottery to Sergeant Bluff in 1862. A series of operators ran this plant from 1862 until its eventual absorption into the Holman yards in the 1890s. Now you can see this list of operators, including William Wortman and D.W. Purdy. These are the two names most familiar to this company, and they would come back and forth as owners, and eventually we end up with J.L. Maddox operating this plant. Now the pottery was not a huge complex, but they could produce about 40,000 gallon jugs per year, or the equivalent. They don't necessarily have to be gallon jugs. They could be 2-gallon jugs, or they could be smaller vessels as well. Sioux City brick manufacturer John Rochelle started his brick plant at 11th and Summit Street in 1869. Now Rochelle had come to Sioux City a few years earlier and beginning at a local brickyard. In 1869, he purchased the former brickyards of James Sawyer, and Rochelle would continue to operate this plant at 11th and Summit until 1891. You can see Rochelle there on the left, and on the right, you can see in the center of this image, there are a couple of sheds in the center. Those are Rochelle's drying sheds right at the corner of 11th and Summit. Here you can see John Rochelle's house, which was built in 1881 at 1123 Summit Street. Throughout the 1880s, Rochelle operated a 140,000 brick kiln. His yard had about 20 employees and could produce nearly 2 million brick per year. The image you see on the right, in the kind of the center of that image, this is a view taken from Prospect Hill, looking to the northeast, and you can see Rochelle's brickyard. You can kind of see the brick out there in the air, drying, which is really a neat image. You can also see, kind of on the left side of that image, there's Rochelle's house and a fairly large clay bank in the background. Now Rochelle's bricks were used in numerous projects in Sioux City in the late 19th century, including the Sioux City linseed oil mill at 2nd and Court Streets, which was built in 1883 and 1884. This project used about 1 million Rochelle bricks. It would be almost all the bricks needed for that project. On the right, you can see Rochelle's brick being used in some of the new packing houses that the Sioux City Stockyards Company was building in the 1880s. 420,000 Rochelle bricks went into those new packing plants. Charles Borowski had a short-lived brickyard and quarry in what is today Stone Park. We know he came into existence in 1867 and had to be around up until about 1870. We know this because the brick and stone used in the Academy of Music building, which opened in 1870, came from Borowski's brick and quarry. You can see on the left, this is kind of the stratigraphy of what Borowski was using for the clay deposits and stone as well. On the right, you can see just an early map of the Stone Park area, and in the center is an image of that 1870 Academy of Music building. Thomas Green started a brickyard in Greenville in 1869. And if you're ever wondering how Greenville got its name, here you have it. What is today Greenville in the 1860s was about a mile outside of Sioux City city limits, so Green is responsible for starting Sioux City's first suburb. Green came here in 1869 and started a brickyard at about 2nd or 1st and Floyd. His first year's production was 350,000 brick. And you can see his kiln and the probably some brick drying here and a couple brick drying sheds right there. Nearing the end of Green's time in Sioux City, or of his first brickyard, he produced bricks for the PV Grand Opera House. So you can see here this large stack of brick. Well, you can thank Tom Green for those. And of course, here is the PV Grand Opera House under construction. The large crowd gathered is actually for the laying of the cornerstone, which is actually on the second floor of the building. The Sergeant Bluff pottery in Sergeant Bluff started in 1873 and was around until the 1890s. Charlie Borders opened this yard near the Holman yard in 73, and here you can see we have the Holman right down here, and here is C.W. Borders just to the west of the cemetery. Borders had a large trade in pottery. He was often exhibiting his wares, which were more than things like jugs and bottles, but he was also making like flower vases and other kind of pots. Similar to the other pottery we talked about, Borders is making roughly 40,000 gallons, or the equivalent of pottery every year. Now, Borders sold to W.D. Irvine, the owner of a dishware company here in Sioux City called the China Hall. Irvine renamed it the Sioux City Pottery, and it's the Sergeant Bluff Pottery. But after a few years of prospecting for gold in Colorado, Borders returned to Sergeant Bluff and bought back his plant in 1889. Some other early brickyards that we see are Jacobs and Russell, Woodley and Crawford, Lorenzo Norris, J.D. Wilcox, the Stolpe brothers, probably in Sergeant Bluff, Henry Huerth in Greenville, Peter Maish on the west side, Anton Hacker in the Greenville area, and H.G. McEwen in 1887. To give you an idea, I've made a handy-dandy little map that kind of shows where these different brickyards were located from the 1860s up through the 1880s. You've got Maish and McEwen on the west side, Moordahl up at 24th and Hamilton. Woodley, we haven't gotten to him yet, but we will in just a moment. You can see Jacobs and Russell, Woodley and Rochelle, all there kind of clustered between 11th and 13th along Perry Creek. And Leeds Robinson with his original plant, which was located very near downtown. Speaking about Charles Woodley, he had that original yard over on Summit Street over by Perry Creek, but he opened a second yard at 17th and Howard Streets in the Floyd River bottoms, and that yard operated between 1881 and 1901. This image was actually taken during the 1892 Floyd River flood, which is, you're seeing some floodwaters here, and believe it or not, this just happens to be the best image, the only image of Woodley's Brickyard that we know of. So I will be using these Sanborn maps because they give a really good idea of how a structure was built and where it was located. So looking at Woodley's Brickyard, it operated part of the year from April through October or November. Unlike a lot of Sioux City's brickyards, Woodley chose to use the loess soil, which again is usually that top layer of soil. In 1883, there was a nice summary of Woodley's business, and it explained how he made common and repressed brick. His plant covered 15 acres. He employed about 30 men and 7 teams of horses to deliver those brick. The kiln, which is located right here, a new Radford-style continuous kiln, was built in 1889, giving Woodley a capacity of about 20,000 bricks per day, or 5 million bricks per year. Woodley's brick was also used in some neat projects through the 1880s, including Armstrong School, which was once located at 8th and Pierce Street, that Bogue packing plant located in the Floyd River bottoms, and the Henry Jant House at 6th and Jennings. Charles W. Ritz, George Ritz, his brother, and financier Fred Evans started a brickyard in 1882, also very near the Holman Yard in Sergeant Bluff. You can see this big chunk of land. So we have the Holman lot right here. There we have Borders. And over here, we have Ritz. His brickyard is going to be concentrated mostly right about in this area. Here we see C.W. Ritz and Fred Evans. Ritz operated that brickyard successfully for several years before selling out to the Sioux City and Sergeant Bluff Terracotta Brick and Tile Company, which formed in 1887. This was a massive company, incorporated in May, with a capital stock of $100,000. Several of the early officers are some of Sioux City's movers and shakers, as well as some of our contractors. Aaron Halseth was a contractor. M.L. Sloan was a wealthy farmer. John Swanson was a contractor. And Matt Flynn was a street contractor. So those are just some of the early officers of that business. Even before the Sioux City and Sergeant Bluff Terracotta Brick and Tile Company opened, they had orders for 300,000 bricks for the Union Stockyards Company packing houses. This company completed their first burn on the 15th of June, 1887. Their first full year of operation, they produced about 4 million brick, and they could manufacture up to about 60,000 brick per day. This was the second brick company in Sioux City that could run year-round. And they were also the first brickyard in Sioux City to have a steam shovel for digging the clay out of the hills. This is an advertisement for that company out of the 1889-90 Sioux City directory. The company's general manager, George Brown, reorganized the business in 1890 with the intention of manufacturing only paving brick. Among the city council, there was a hot topic. Do we keep paving Sioux City streets in cedar blocks, or do we go to brick? So there was a great debate about the use of brick. Brick streets in Sioux City never really took off well, but those that we do have were largely laid between the 1880s and the 1890s. The newly organized company was capitalized at $150,000, and rebuilding of the whole plant began when completed in May of 1891. The new works had a daily capacity of 80,000 bricks. They had 5 large downdraft kilns and a large Radford continuous kiln. Now, I've been using this word continuous. I've said it once before. So unlike that dome kiln that we saw earlier, which is simply a single chamber in which you heat and cool all in a single kiln, there are multiple chambers. In a continuous kiln, there's a constant fire where one chamber is actually being fired, and while it's being fired, the other chambers are either being preheated to help the drying process, or the bricks are cooling down. So you could have a kiln being fired right here, kiln the brick being fired, while in this chamber you have the finished brick being removed. You never have to turn off the fire. It's going constantly. In April of 1892, company officer M.L. Flynn had secured the brickworks a contract for 3 million brick to pave 4th Street and West 7th. Unfortunately, an immense fire in October of 1892 destroyed the brick-making machinery and drying sheds at this Sergeant Bluff plant. Plans to rebuild were announced a few months later, and the new plant was dedicated to building brick instead of paving brick. Some of this new building brick was used in the building you can see here, which is the Masonic building at 5th and Douglas, built in 1893. Poor economic conditions following the Panic of 1893 forced the closure of this plant in 1896. The Sergeant Bluff Brick Company, 6 years later, reopened this plant. In fact, it's done by Ritz. Charles Ritz had reassumed control of his brickyard and opened it again after those 6 years. It may surprise you that there are several magazines dedicated entirely to the brick and clayworking industries. And in January 1901 article about the brick industry here in Sioux City noted this. This was written during the interim between the end of one brick company and before a new one was operating this yard. The title was "A Yard That Had Passed into History." Within a few hundred feet of the Holman yard, we noticed an extensive plant and found it to be the remains of a venture in brickmaking on a large scale. Something like $175,000 was sunk into the venture. 4 large downdraft kilns had recently been torn down. Mr. Holman says they have been keeping the continuous kiln to tempt him, but thinks the yard is haunted by the ghost of failure. The Sergeant Bluff Brick Company, or the C.W. Ritz Company, however you'd like to call it, was formed in 1902, and they fired their first brick in 1904. In addition to the old continuous kiln that had been there from the previous owners, Ritz built another kiln specifically for making building brick to supply the 10 million bricks that were needed for the construction of Armour and Company packing. Ritz ran the yard for about 4 more years until 1906. Lauren J. Haskins would revive this plant another 3 years later, so reopened for the 1909 season. Haskins' plant, after it was improved and modernized, could produce 12 million common or repressed or vitrified face brick per year. In 1912, I.G. Morgan, J.C. Laughlin, and D.P. Mahoney and E.M. Cormett reorganized the company into the Haskins Impervious Face Brick Company with a capital stock of $200,000 and an increased production capacity to 100,000 face brick per day. This was the largest exclusive face brick plant in the country. I have alluded to this just a little bit. I've talked about common brick and face brick. Common brick is used for the structure of a building. It's great stuff, it's very strong, but it's not as impervious to weather as a face brick. Face brick is often salt is added to the kiln process to vitrify it, or essentially add a glass-like layer to the outside of a brick to make it more resistant to weathering. Here is a brick from the L.J. Haskins brick plant. It is this brick right here. These are all from my backyard, by the way, because who doesn't have a bunch of stamped brick in their backyard? Moving on to a different brickyard, that of Charles P. Moordahl, which was later Peterson and Smith. This was located at 24th and Hamilton and was around from 1885 to 1901. Moordahl operated the brickyard until 1887 when he passed away. The yard is equipped with an H. Martin soft mud brick press and a clamp kiln. So we're going back to those older days with a clamp kiln. And a soft mud brick press, this just means that the clay going into the brick machine is softer. It's got a lot more water content and it's easier to push through the brick machines. Moordahl's capacity was about 1 million brick per year. Moordahl died in 1887 and the business was taken over by William Peterson and John Smith. The yard would eventually close in 1901. And this is just a really cool ledger we have in the museum collection. This is from 1893, just showing the price of some of the brick and who's buying them. I see there's an order there by James P. Wall for $84. I figured that is probably about 20,000 brick, so enough to build a smaller house. Or you can see over here we have just a simple order for 500 brick for $3.65. The Sioux City Brick and Tile Works was located in Springdale, or roughly 31st and Floyd Boulevard. That dates back to 1886. Now, Tom Green, who had been in Greenville, and Henry Huerth, who had also been in Greenville, their clay deposits were becoming depleted. They, and some other investors, believed the Springdale site with access to diverse clay and rail access was the best site for a new plant. A kiln was built, and a first firing of 150,000 bricks took place in October of '86. That brick was all used in the continual building up of facilities at that plant. Initially, then the company was eventually incorporated in November of 1886 by Charles Franklin Hoyt, Tom Green, Constant R. Marks, Henry Huerth, and William Stevens. This is an artist depiction of the Sioux City Brick and Tile Works in Springdale. They're showing 3 big kilns there in the front. However, they only ever had 2, just a Radford and a Hoffman continuous kiln. C.F. Hoyt, president of the Brick and Tile Works, platted the neighborhood of Springdale. So if any of you have a long memory going way back, there was a community right across the Floyd River from what used to be Sioux Tools. It was Springdale, and this was established in 1888 by Hoyt for workers at his brick plant. By 1892, half of the people living in Springdale were employees at his brickyard. And you can kind of see here is Springdale, the Floyd River, and these black dots are the buildings of the Sioux City Brick and Tile Works. This brickworks had the capacity of 75,000 common, pressed, and ornamental bricks per day, or about 12 million a year. This was Sioux City's first brick plant that could run year-round. Kind of looking at Sanborn maps again, because I just find them fascinating about all the things they tell us. We're looking at, you have a clay hill over here. Here are your elevated walkways that allow you to get brick or clay from the hills into brick machines, which are right here in this structure and right here in this structure. Then you could go to the drying houses, and here you also have a drying house before going to one of the two kilns. This upper kiln is a newer Hoffman kiln built in 1888, and this is an 1886 Radford partition kiln. Brick from this Sioux City Brick and Tile Works was used in many different places, including the Bancroft School, which you can see here on Pearl Street, the Sioux City Cable Railway Powerhouse, and foundations for the railroad's tracks, the Iowa Block, the Howell Block, the Paris Stove Works, which you can see here, and other factories in Leeds were supplied by brick from Sioux City Brick and Tile Works, and the Plymouth and Evan blocks over on historic 4th Street. This is the Plymouth block right here, built in 1890. Moving over to Riverside is the Sioux City Stoneware Company. It was active from 1888 to 1892. It was located about on the present-day site of Sacred Heart Catholic Church. Articles of incorporation for this business were filed in May of 1888 with some names we've seen before. C.F. Hoyt, president. Julian K. Prug, who was a queensware and stoneware dealer here in Sioux City. Interestingly, the photographer, James H. Hamilton. Educator, William Stevens. And capitalist, William Gordon. $70,000 worth of stock was issued for the construction of machinery buildings and what they proposed, 6 kilns. Their first pottery was fired in 1889, and that would be 9,100 gallons. That is, in one kiln, that's the entire production of the other stonewares that were around at this time. So it's a pretty big organization. You can see here, company president C.F. Hoyt also platted Riverside, just like he had done with Springdale. So at this point, we have 3 brickyards that helped start 3 city suburbs. We had Greenville, Springdale, and now we have Riverside. This area was also known as Prugville. We just saw Julian K. Prug, or Hoytville. That all makes sense since it was platted by C.F. Hoyt. This image also shows the location of not only the Stoneware Company, which is right here, it also shows the location of the next 2 plants we're going to be talking about here, and then one way down here. This is an image of Sioux City Stoneware Company's Clay Bank. Here's a Sanborn map of what all they have going on in their facility, including their warehouse, the single kiln and shed, the turning room for turning pottery, the jolly room, which a jolly is just kind of an automatic turning machine. So once you had a sample of something turned, you could set other pieces up on the jolly and it would be done automatically. You can see the engine room and clay grinders right down here. This stoneware company, even though it was a pretty massive investment, only lasted a few years and closed around the time of the Panic of 1893. Eventually, the Sioux City Brick and Tile Works would buy this property around 1900. Just to the south of the Sioux City Stoneware Company was the Sioux Paving Brick Company, located on the north side of West 19th along Riverside Boulevard, basically where Kirk Hansen softball complex is today, is where this plant would be. Articles of incorporation were filed in 1890. Officers C.F. Hoyt, W.B. Lower, and Madison Davis. $50,000 of stock was issued for the construction of machinery buildings, a drying house, and a large Hoffman continuous kiln with a capacity of 500,000 brick. Here we can see the stratigraphy of the clay bank at the Sioux Paving Brick Company. You have loess and gravel at the top, stone, and then different shales coming down through the hill. Finally, you get to clay shale and sandstone and dark gray clay near the base of the hill, which are all used in brick production. This is just a couple of Sanborn maps showing the progress between 1890 and 1902. We have the additional drying houses and new equipment, and most notably, large kiln and a downdraft kiln. Even though this is called the Paving Brick Company, it existed for 6 years before they made a single paving brick, and that was when they were able to make bricks for paving when they built this second continuous kiln. Here is an overview looking at that Sioux Paving Brick Company, looking off to the southwest in Riverside. Brick from the Sioux Paving Brick Company was used in the Tollerton and Stetson building, which was located at 3rd in Nebraska, and also used in street paving. A couple of years ago, when 5th Street was being resurfaced, I walked by and saw the brick underneath the asphalt. I just had to get a picture, and I've all put it together, and we know now that this brick came from the Sioux Paving Brick Company. So I just thought that was a neat little thing to throw in there. Farther south in Riverside was the Northwestern Sewer Pipe Company. This is at the south end of Riverside, but still north of Riverside Park. This company started in 1890 by W.W. Byam, L.A. Altoona, and D.A. Jackson. About $80,000 was invested in buildings, machinery, and kilns. They finally got into operation and fired their first sewer tile in October of 1891. This is an image of their clay bank. Again, we're back to this image where we can see the Stoneware Company, the Paving Brick Company, and the one we're talking about right now is the Sewer Pipe Company right down here. The construction of 9 Uliday kilns completed the initial plans of this company. Though sewer pipe was a primary product of the plant, the Iowa Geological Survey noted that the clay here could be used for fire brick, fancy brick, terracotta, and even stoneware. Like some of the other companies we've seen, in the wake of the Panic of 1893, the Northwestern Sewer Pipe Company closed and opened, different owners here and there. Here's a neat ad from 1892 for their steam-pressed vitrified salt-glazed sewer pipe. The plant, after it closed in the Panic of 93, sat largely vacant from 1893 to 1895. By 1894, Byam was out of it, but J.M. Lai, F.B. Hutchins, and W.E. Carter had taken over and reorganized the plant into the Northwestern Sewer Pipe Company. The company was again reorganized and called the Sioux City Sewer Pipe Company. The Sewer Pipe Company fell into bankruptcy in April of 1897. The plant was sold at auction in 1898. Sumner Clark of Peoria, Illinois, bought that plant, that $80,000 plant, for $8,500. Clark, W.B. Lower, E.W. Rice, and A.L. Stetson organized the Lower Brick Company to operate this brickyard in July of 1898. Production switched to common brick, hollow tile, and sidewalk brick. Lower bought out Clark and Stetson in 1901. Lower went on to modernize older kilns and added some Holman-type kilns and later a couple of large continuous kilns on that site. Here are a couple of bricks manufactured at the Lower plant, including this great stamped brick, Lower Brick Company, Sioux City. And this brick over here with the X's on it, that is a sidewalk brick. And that would have been manufactured at the Lower Brickyards. The Leeds Brickyard started in 1892 and lasted until around 1910. This is located about a half a mile east of Leeds at 41st Street and Smith River Road. This was incorporated by William Johnston, Nude Moe, Christian Nelson, S.H. Moore, and William Gordon. The plant was operated by 24 employees and had an annual production of about 2 million brick. This business, like some of the others, really struggled through the 1890s. It was operational right after its founding in 92, went into bankruptcy and foreclosure in 93, It operated again in 1894 and 1895. Another bankruptcy, and it was closed down in 1896 and 1897. Finally, in 1899, this plant was bought by A.L. Stetson and W.B. Lower and Christian Nelson, who got it up and going again. We're now entering the era of consolidations. W.B. Lower and Stetson, owners of the Lower Brick Company, we just saw they bought the Leeds Brickworks in 1899. Lower and Stetson also bought the Woodley Brickyard after Woodley's death in 1899. Lower and Stetson merged the Sioux Paving Brick Company and the Lower Brick Company in 1899. Then Lower bought out all of Stetson's shares in 1901, so he was, for a while, the sole owner. Now, a fire destroyed the Leeds Brickworks in 1901. Lower decided not to rebuild. Lower sold the Woodley Brickyard in 1902 to a railroad for expansion of facilities. Then, Minneapolis investors led by George and E.N. Fairchild purchased this combined Sioux Paving Brick Company, Lower Brick Company in 1902 for $150,000. William Lower, however, continued to manage both of those yards. The combined Lower and Sioux Paving Brick Company expanded greatly under the Fairchild ownership. The Sioux Paving Brick Company installed new boilers and kilns. Lower built a new 20-chamber continuous kiln and 10 slow-burning downdraft kilns, and the capacity of their kilns increased by 1.5 million bricks after that renovation. Combined, the two yards had 185 employees and could manufacture 125,000 bricks per day. These two yards, like the two others here in town, transitioned to year-round production with an annual capacity around 36 million brick. Some of their products included Riverside solid building brick and hollow brick, which is what you see over there. That's a picture of a hollow brick, and that hollow brick is right here. You can see the two holes running down the length of this build. It helped save mortar, and it also saved in weight. Here's an overview of the Lower Brick Company in South Riverside. You can see these downdraft kilns here and the two large continuous kilns right here along the railroad tracks. These are some interior shots from the Clay Worker magazine. This is hollow tile heading to the drying house in 1906. Here is unfired brick in one of the kilns in 1906. Also in 1906, here is completed fired brick being removed from one of the continuous kilns. And just so we don't forget what some of these places look like, this is the plant of the Sioux Paving Brick Company in North Riverside around 1910. Going back to the Leeds Brickworks, which is really a complicated timeline. We remember that Lower decided not to rebuild after the fire, but Christian Nelson, who had long been associated with that brickyard, did decide to rebuild. The fire had destroyed kilns and machinery, but had also left 600,000 fired bricks still in the kilns that were undamaged. Nelson sold those to the Sioux Beet Syrup Company in South Sioux City to raise money to rebuild his works. The three kilns were rebuilt, machinery replaced, and the Leeds Brickworks was back at it, making about 25,000 bricks per day. It didn't last very long. The brickyard did not operate from 1902 to 1904. In 1905, H.C. and W.C. McNeil reopened the plant as the Leeds Brick Company, and again, the plant did not operate after that reorganization, and the works were removed around 1914. The Sioux City Brick and Tile Works, this is the one that's based in Springdale, opened a second yard in Riverside in 1902. This was their big expansion of that year. This was located right in between the Sioux Paving Brick Company and the Lower Brick Company yards. So this is a 67-acre lot, which I already told you about. They started producing brick in the spring of 1903. The primary product of this plant was sidewalk brick and paving brick and drain tile. Here you can see brick coming down the conveyor out of the Pug Mill. Again, some 1903 issue of Clay Worker magazine. Here is unfired brick in the kilns there in Riverside. Here is fired tile, sewer tile, in the Hoffman continuous kiln in 1903. This yard was expanded. A second kiln was added to the yard in 1907. So here's your original one, and there's the new one. This kiln, when completed, was the largest in Iowa, measuring 96 feet wide and 172 feet long. With the completion of this kiln, the Sioux City Brick and Tile in Riverside was the largest common brick plant in the state of Iowa. Here are just a couple of ads from the city directories showing from about 1903 up through 1907 or 1912, the growth of capacity. Here in 1912, we're up to almost 40 million brick capacity for the 2 yards of Sioux City Brick and Tile Works. More mergers happened in the early part of the 20th century. In 1909, the Fairchilds, who owned the Sioux Paving Brick Company, Lower Brick Company, bought the Holman Brick Company at Sergeant Bluff. Here's an ad from the directory and from the Improvement magazine showing the combined 3 brickyard company with their combined capacity of 45 million repressed, common, and patterned sidewalk brick per year. Here are a couple of bricks from the yards out there, including a Holman stamped brick and a Facetone stamped brick. Both of these bricks would have been manufactured around 1910. Clay Products Company is organized in 1911 to operate the plants that the Fairchilds had purchased. So it was incorporated by George Fairchild, D.C. Shull, and Stillwell. We're talking about several plants, including the Sioux Paving Brick Company, Lower, Holman, and the Cherry Red Press Brick Company of Correctionville all fall under this Clay Products Company merger. Clay Products Company, they had some great stamped bricks, which you can see here. This is one of their repressed bricks. And here's a neat advertisement from a 1913 high school yearbook, of all things, for Sioux silo blocks, as well as various other products that you can see listed there. More changes are ahead. In 1912, the Clay Products Company elected Lemuel Mallory to replace George Fairchild as president and manager. Tom Green Jr. left the Sioux City Brick and Tile Works and hired to manage the Clay Products Company brickyards. In 1913, Sioux City Brick and Tile Works was reorganized by a couple of attorneys into the Sioux City Brick and Tile Company. In October of 1913, the new Sioux City Brick and Tile Company bought Clay Products Company. And finally, in January of 1914, the Sioux City Brick and Tile Company increased its capital stock and bought the Haskins Impervious Face Brick Company, making all of Sioux City's operating brickyards under one company. All a single management now. There's Lem Mallory and Tom W. Green the younger. Well, Tom Green apparently wasn't very satisfied in his new role at the Sioux City Brick and Tile Company, and he and his wife Helena started their own brickyards at 4200 Correctionville Road. It was a $125,000 brick plant. Green had help from his former employees, both in Riverside and Springdale, that came out to help him get his new plant open. Green eventually hired 45 employees to run the plant, which could make 50,000 bricks per year. The large continuous kilns on the property could each fire 1 million bricks over the course of 19 days. Through the remainder of that decade, the teens, Green did really well. Unfortunately, there was a minor recession here in the Midwest in the early 1920s, and Green really never recovered from that, and the plant closed in 1924. His bricks, however, did manage to get out in the market, and they were used in the construction of the former North Junior High School built in 1923. So going back to Sioux City Brick and Tile, we've left Green. We have 3 yards in Riverside, 2 yards in Sergeant Bluff, 1 yard in Springdale. Sioux City Brick and Tile Company again reorganized in 1917 with the transfer and cancellation of stocks and bonds. D.P. Mahoney, the son-in-law of Lauren J. Haskins, took over management, and growth continued from this era. By 1922, the Sioux City Brickyards were producing about 110 million bricks on an annual basis. And there's DP Mahoney. So here is Sioux City Brick and Tile Company number 1. We've seen this plant before. They are manufacturing clay rocks brick with a daily capacity of making 105 of those. The 2 kilns had a combined capacity of 2 million brick. This brick here was fired at 1900 degrees for roughly 60 hours. There were 3,000 dealers of clay rocks brick in the Midwest. Let's see. This is a clay rocks brick. Sioux City Brick and Tile, plant number 2. This is the former lower yard. This plant manufactured hollow building tile, was mostly used in interior walls, cellars, and foundations. We're talking about a large format hollow brick that came in sizes from 5 inches by 8 inches by 12 inches, which was equivalent to 7 bricks, up to 12 by 12 by 12, which is the equivalent of 24 standard common bricks. Here you can see the outline of the Sioux City Brick and Tile plant number 2 with its 7 kilns there and its 2 large continuous kilns. Just so you get an idea, I didn't have a good picture of clay tile. This is the construction of West Junior High School in 1918, and here you can see the building under construction in the background. You can see the large pile of face brick, but also the hollow clay tile. These look to be about 8 by 12 by 12 size. And this is the Sioux City Brick and Tile plant number 3, the former Sioux Paving Brick Company. They manufactured New Sioux brick. I know it's kind of hard to read. Where's my New Sioux? This is a New Sioux brick, common brick. Now, production of this plant was about 80,000 bricks per day. They had quite extensive machinery, including the 3 large Hoffman continuous kilns and 1 downdraft kiln, which you can all see in that map. The Sioux City Brick and Tile Company in Riverside was connected by a narrow gauge railroad and uses a steam shovel. This photo is from the 1920s. The old Sioux City Brick and Tile plant number 1 had become plant number 4 by the 19-teens. They had suffered a fire and partially reopened, but it never met up to its full glory. You can see here we have this area operating with a single kiln, and that is the ruin of a kiln. And of course we can see at the top it says site for new factory. So this is about 1917 when all this is torn down to make way for a new Sioux Tools plant. And here we have Sioux City Brick and Tile plant number 5, West Yard. This is the former Holman Brickyard in Sergeant Bluff. The 2 plants, there was an East Yard and West Yard at plant number 5. They are manufacturing special Roman brick in the 19-teens for the construction of the Woodbury County Courthouse. And you can see this is a picture of the construction of the courthouse, and this is a large pile of that Roman brick being ready to be mortared. Oops. This is the East Yard of Sioux City Brick and Tile, plant number 5. This is the former Haskins, which is the former Sioux City and Sergeant Bluff Terracotta Brick and Tile Company, which is the former Ritz Yard. It's kind of confusing when you get all these different owners over the years. That plant, the old Haskins plant, burned in a tremendous fire in 1919. The Ballou Brick Company was organized by Kansas City investors, B.W. Ballou, I.R. Samort, and locally here, D.P. Mahoney, to collect the insurance money from that burned out brick plant, which was about $200,000 in insurance money. That plant number 5 West Yard, the former Holman Yard, had been inactive for just a couple of years and was demolished for the construction of the new Ballou brickworks, which you can see. So the old Holman plant was right here. The old Haskins plant was right here. And in between we have construction, or the Ballou plant. This is actually a 1958 aerial image. Of course, Mahoney remained manager. This is a really great photograph of the Ballou Brick Company. You can see the new Ballou Brickworks right over here, and right in the background here you can still see the Holman Brickyard with its kilns, and these mounds, these are actually big clamp kilns. So those things we talked about way early on in brick making. This is the beginning of the end of Riverside now, we're starting to see. By the 40s and 50s, new construction methods, new materials, decreased demand for common brick, like the new Sioux and the clay rocks. And the northernmost of the Sioux City brick and tile company plants was closed in the 1940s. Here are its remains. Plant number 1, the middle one, closed in the 1950s. And plant number 2, the former lower plant, closed in 1964. But there are big things going on in Sergeant Bluff in these years. A new tunnel kiln had been installed at the Sergeant Bluff yard in 1964. This new ultra-efficient tunnel kiln another one was built in 1972. Moving forward, this is 1988, and this is an aerial view of the only operating brick plant in the Sioux City area, and that is, of course, the Holman, or the Sioux City brick yards. Some more recent projects looking at what brick is today. The Sioux City brick made brick for the Dakota Dunes Country Club building to match the color of the sand. Here we can see pictured Norm Mahoney, president, Parnell Mahoney, and John Hill, executive officer. Here's an image of members of the Mahoney family celebrating the 80th anniversary of Sioux City Brick and the opening of a new showroom on Floyd Boulevard. In 1996 and 1997, Sioux City Brick installed a $12 million face brick plant, which was largely computer controlled except for the final hand packaging that was done by hand and for final inspections. This is Norm Mahoney standing by North America's first hydro-cased brick tunnel kiln in March of 1997. These are pictures taken by the Sioux City Journal in 2006. Here we can see brick loaded on a car headed into one of the kilns at Sioux City Brick in Sergeant Bluff. Here's that same brick coming out of that kiln. The plant is heavily mechanized, and these are robotic arms that help move finished fired brick from the rollers onto pallets. This photo taken in 1997. Here's kind of the final step. Employees quality checking and stacking brick from the conveyor belt into the hoppers there on the side. This image taken in 2006. So, the vast prehistoric seas seem to have deposited below and all about the site of Sioux City clay enough to make bricks of the finest quality to build 100 Londons. So reported the Sioux City Journal in 1899. I tell you what, I could go on and on and on about brick all day, but you've already put up with me for quite a while, so thank you all for coming and learning a little bit about Sioux City's brick industry. Thank you so much, and now's your time for questions. So thanks everybody for coming.